Ross Harries is with us. He's the presenter of BBC Scrum, and the broadcaster of BT Sport and Premier Sports. Ross, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning. I'm very well, thank you, gents.
Things not going great for Wayne Pivac at the moment. The whole COVID issue, which had been a massive cloud hanging over the entire tournament, particularly from the French perspective, where we weren't sure we were going to have a tournament. Massive protocols had to be ramped up and everybody had to sign up to them to give the French confidence. And then first weekend, and Josh Adams was like, it doesn't really apply to me, does it?
Yeah, far from ideal, isn't it? And Josh Adams, of all the players for this to have happened to, is the least likely candidate. You know, he's one of the more mature, reasoned members of this squad. So when I'd heard it had happened, I was kind of speculating in my mind as to who it might have been, and he'd have been way, way down on the list. So I was really, really surprised. You know, he's not a reckless sort of bloke and not the kind of guy that normally ignores the rules. But yeah, on this occasion, just an absolute brain fart, I guess you could describe it as. You know, the gathering he was at was apparently posted on social media, so someone somewhere didn't think there was anything wrong with this. But of course, the ramifications it could have been massive. You know, he came back and trained, did a full session with the squad before it was discovered what had happened. So had he contracted it and it had gone through the squad, the whole tournament could have been in doubt. So yeah, very, very dodgy start for Wayne Pivac in his squad.
So if one of the mature players isn't fully au fait or hasn't quite copped what you're supposed to be doing, does this suggest that there's an issue, a broader issue, or is it just a brain fart? Like, does this call into question Wayne Pivac's leadership and the management and their, you know, just their power over the group at the moment, or are we reading too much into that?
I think, yeah, you're probably reading a little bit too much into that. I mean, Wayne Pivac is a disciplinarian, and he has been throughout his time in Wales. You know, there were times when he arrived at the Scarlets years ago now, 5-6 years ago, and there was sort of a suggestion of a mutiny there because a lot of players weren't happy with his methods, and he dealt with that very swiftly, and those players were moved on, and he went on to become a very successful club coach. And he's dealt with this, I think, very swiftly and quite strongly as well, you know, suspending the player for 2 games. You know, we've seen footballers do similar things and not have suspensions. So I think this has been dealt with swiftly and strongly. I don't think there's any question that the management have lost control of the group. It's just a one-off case from what I can understand. I just hope, as I say, that, you know, it hasn't spread to the squad and we won't turn up positive tests further down the line. But I think for now, they just want to park this and get on with the rugby.
Speaking of the rugby, what is your expectation in terms of performance levels from this Wayne Pivac team? Because we haven't yet seen him transform what he was able to do at club level to the national side.
Yeah, it's a strange one. I was an advocate of Wayne Pivac getting the job. You know, I watched his Scarlets team progress the way they did, and they played some absolutely beautiful rugby under his tenure, including, and you guys will remember this well, that final against Munster in the Pro 14, where everyone thought they were the underdogs by some margin, and they ended up blowing Munster off the park with a kind of champagne display of rugby. So I was an advocate of him getting the job over Dave Rennie in the first place because I'd seen firsthand how he transformed that Scarlet side. And I think the romantics in Wales were expecting him to be able to do the same with Wales really quickly. And even during the Warren Gatland era, which is, you know, the third golden era of Welsh rugby, there were a huge constituency of Welsh fans who didn't like the way Wales played. They liked the fact they were winning trophies, but they didn't like the fairly one-dimensional way that Wales were playing, and they wanted a more multi-dimensional game. And that was, I think, what the romantics think or thought Wayne Pivac would bring. It's just taking a longer time than they realised, and Test rugby is the most unforgiving arena. You know, you don't have the luxury of 2 seasons at club level where you can evolve and tweak. You need to start winning quite soon, and that's the position Wayne Pivac finds himself in now. 3 wins in his first 10 games, admittedly, you know, disrupted by COVID and all kinds of other things going on, but he's not the only coach having to deal with that. He's just the unfortunate one who's come into a position occupied by someone for 12 years who is enormously successful and now has to change things and go in a completely different direction.
Did you see bright sparks, Ross, last year from what Pivac was trying to do? Obviously, when we look at the results, it doesn't look good. But from watching every single game last year, do you see that there's a potential uptick in certain areas of this team?
I've not seen a great deal, to be honest, and that's why it's becoming an area of concern. You know, there were glimpses. You go back to the first Six Nations game last year against Italy, when they nailed Italy at home. It seems weird to think that was barely a year ago, and it was a full, sold-out Principality Stadium. And they scored some lovely tries. But of course, that was against Italy. There's always that caveat. And they also made some defensive howlers in that game, which against a more competent international team, they'd have paid the price for. You know, the Autumn Nations Cup, that game against Ireland was a nightmare to watch from a Welsh perspective. They just seemed to offer nothing whatsoever and appeared to have regressed. Against England in the Autumn Nations Cup, we saw a bit of steel that was always associated with the Gatland years. You know, defensive steel, physicality, and a lot of people thought they wouldn't stand up physically to that challenge of England. But the Georgia game, which everyone thought would be the one where Pivac's Wales would come to life, because it was an opposition we could afford to throw the ball about against, admittedly in pretty grim conditions down in Llanelli, but they just really struggled to get over the line, stumbled away to victory in that game. So the answer is, as yet, we haven't seen any real evidence of the Pivac era. I'm just hoping that the mantra that's come from this management group, that the Autumn Nations Cup was all about developing players, and they did. You know, Shane Lewis-Hughes, Jim Botham, Callum Sheedy, Johan Lloyd, all these guys got exposure to Test rugby. This squad looks a bit more like a squad that's been picked to go out and win games. So there's still, we've still got the faith here in Wales, but there is kind of growing whispers that perhaps, you know, his time, or he may not have the luxury of time to mould this side in his image.
They're up against a team this weekend who also struggled to put Georgia away in the Nations Cup. So it's not world beaters that they're up against this weekend by any stretch of the imagination. So there must be a quiet Welsh confidence that certain people who've been talking up Ireland all week and talking down Wales are going to be put right back in their place come Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, I did feel like I had to come out swinging today, boys, after what you said. It's upset a few people over here in Wales. But it's strange, isn't it? This Wales-Ireland dynamic, ever since Warren Gatland got the Wales job, and everyone knew about the Eddie O'Sullivan issues and the way he left the IRFU. And it almost became theatre, this fixture. You know, 2009, when Warren Gatland erroneously claimed that Ireland were the team that Welsh players and fans hated the most. No one believed it. It was absolute nonsense. Everyone knows that England are the team Welsh players and fans hate the most. Ireland, there was always this mutual respect for. And I think Wales and Ireland went on this kind of journey together, in that we started becoming successful at roughly the same time. And there was that period where Wales and Ireland were joint favourites for virtually every campaign. You know, 2008, Wales won the Slam. 2009, Ireland came to Cardiff and took it off them from under their noses, and the drop goal duel and all that kind of stuff. So there's always been this, or at least for the last 10, 15 years, this frisson to this fixture. And I don't think there's ever an outright favourite for that reason. You know, we often do well in Dublin. You often come over here and do well in Cardiff. But I'm just thinking back to the last few fixtures, in particular that one in the Nations Cup, when it was similar sort of squads going up against one another. And Wales just didn't appear to have anything in their locker at all. So for those reasons, I think a lot of people are a little bit fearful of Ireland coming here and doing another job on them. The only positive thing from a Welsh perspective is, you know, as you've mentioned, Ireland aren't exactly world beaters at the moment. They struggle physically against England. They still, like Wales, seem to be in a bit of a transitional period under Farrell. He hasn't quite yet put his imprint on this squad, I don't think. So Wales won't be feeling utterly despondent, but I still think Ireland are the favourites on Sunday, albeit by, I think the bookies have got them at a point or something.
There's roughly 3 points here, so maybe it's one there, and that would make a bit of sense. Can I talk to you about the role of Gatland Jenkins in this? It's just one of the papers today here is making the point that Wayne Pivac could have had Sean Edwards if he'd kept him, then couldn't keep Sam Warburton, and now has Gatland Jenkins as his defensive mastermind. Maybe Gatland Jenkins is actually one of the great rugby brains of his time, and that's a possibility. He's quite inexperienced, and it's always going to be difficult to follow in the footsteps of somebody like Sean Edwards, particularly when it's so annoying he's gone off and turned France into such a brilliant team. Like, of all of the things he could have done for us in this part of the world, not going to France would have been, go to rugby league, that'd be great for all of us. Is Gatland Jenkins good enough, and when will you guys know that?
He will be good enough. You're right though in the fact that he is very inexperienced at this level. He was coaching the Cardiff RFC squad, so the semi-professional side beneath the Blues, and he'd been doing a little bit of work with the youth academy boys as well. And then all of a sudden he finds himself thrust into this role with a lot more scrutiny. He's a tough bloke, and he doesn't care what anyone thinks about him. And I think one of the key characteristics you need for a job in the national coaching setup is to not give a damn. And he certainly doesn't give a damn. He's not going to be rocked by criticism. And he's got the respect of the squad. He's got that almost Sean Edwards-esque demeanour about him. He calls people out. He singles people out. If someone makes a defensive error, he'll remember it, he'll log it, and he'll give them a right rollicking about it in the defensive meeting on the Monday. So he's not lacking in authority, and he's certainly not lacking in knowledge. Even 5 years before he retired, people were saying he coaches on the field. He's the coach's eyes and ears on the field. Warren Gatland used him as a lieutenant as much as he did as a prop forward. And he was never the best scrummager. He'll admit that himself, but he got picked, because of his work at the breakdown and his energy and his engine, but also because of his ability to see play unfold about him. So he's got all the credentials, but as you said, I would have preferred him to have learned his trade, sharpened his tools at a Welsh club side, at a Welsh region, and then get elevated into the position he's in. But the position Wales were in was they lost, or they sacked Bayer and Hayward, in the middle of a campaign or at the very start of a campaign. They had no choice really but to summon someone who they knew was free. They couldn't go to the market and secure the best defence coach in the world. And the fact they're now offering him a longer term contract means he must have done enough to impress on the inside.
How much time does Pivac have? Because this is an interesting conversation that Bernard just was on with us last week and kind of was fairly casual, but also pointing out that you don't really sack the coach after next year's Six Nations, almost irrespective, unless it's a complete disaster, because that's a year out from the World Cup. However, rugby unions are definitely going to look at this Six Nations and go, well, the new coach will have time to fix it if it's a disaster. So if it's a disaster for Ireland, Andy Farrell is really up against it. If it's a disaster for Pivac, is there even rumblings that it's now or never? He survive now, they're definitely going to keep you after what happens next year.
There's an element of that. I mean, Wales can be the most unforgiving place to be a rugby coach, and there were whisperings of him being sacked halfway through last year's Six Nations, and that will always be in Wales. And prior to Warren Gatland, who was here for 12 years, we had a habit of sacking coaches, weeks before World Cup sometimes. For the 95 World Cup, Alex Evans had been coached for about 4 weeks. And Gareth Jenkins was sacked in the car park after the World Cup in 2007. I can't see that happening right now. There's something of a power vacuum at the WRU because Martin Phillips, the long-time chief exec, has left. Gareth Davis, the chairman, lost a seat on the council, so he's no longer chairman. So the finance officer who worked under Roger Lewis, the previous chief exec, is now the acting chief exec. Ryan Jones has left from his job looking after all rugby at pro level. Gareth Davis, as I say, has left. There's a new chairman in who, while very respected, comes from the ranks of club and grassroots rugby, so doesn't necessarily have that business experience that Gareth Davis had. So there's a sort of feeling that there isn't someone vastly experienced in charge who would grasp the nettle and make a really bold decision to sack a coach like that. So I think that buys Wayne Pivac a bit more time. And publicly, as you'd expect, the union have been very supportive of him, and they've said he's got this contract to take us through to the next World Cup. But it's known that there's a break clause in that contract after 2 years. And he's approaching that time fairly swiftly because he took the job officially while Warren Gatland was still there. There was an overlap period where he came in and learned the ropes and shadowed during the World Cup. So, yeah, there is an element of make or break. Wales, as I say, are famous for making rash decisions, or at least they were before the Warren Gatland era. If you're asking me personally, having seen what he did at Llanelli Scarlets and the way it took a while to convince the squad that this was the way, I think he needs time, because I've seen a Wayne Pivac side at their best rip teams to shreds and do so without necessarily being overtly physical. There's a kind of school of thought that you have to be physical in Test rugby. It's a level above, and maybe that's right. But if you're asking me personally, I'd like to see him given a bit more time.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. Ross, we did seem to make a bit of a stir with our comments during the week. People obviously have nothing better to do with their time.
We're very sensitive in Wales, and sometimes when that temperature rises, people can't tell the difference between what's tongue-in-cheek and what's not. But funnily enough, as I was about to go to bed last night, I was tweeted by someone saying quite angrily, "What are your thoughts of these guys over the Irish Sea and stuff?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'm speaking to them both tomorrow morning, so I can address it with them head on." But you seem like a very polite and mellow gentleman. So
did we touch a nerve? Is that what happened? Is there an element of there's a fear in Welsh rugby that actually you might be on the precipice of a disaster, but equally, maybe
the nerves in Wales are always red raw ahead of a Six Nations tournament. You don't have to touch a nerve; they are already pulsating and raw and ready to be wounded. So yeah, and I'm sure you're well aware of that. I don't know what it is about our national psyche, but it's okay for Welsh people to criticise the Welsh rugby team. That's a national sport, and we're very good at it. But if someone else dares to do similar, then woe betide them.
Can I just say, Ross, we've got an exceptional record. Before the first game of the 2019 Six Nations, we said that no England player would get into the Ireland team. And I don't think Ireland laid a single glove on England ever since. And we single-handedly changed the rivalry. So congratulations in advance to Welsh rugby on their dominance in this rivalry over the next few years.
Well, in my back pocket, see, if this was going to get a bit tasty, I did have all the significant victories Wales over Ireland, of which there have been many in the last decade. But I've not had need to bring those out.
Oh, look, we're all too familiar with them. That's why if there's a slight, in any way, alteration in the balance of power in this rivalry, we're going to enjoy it for a change. Ross, good stuff.
Wouldn't you?
Thanks a million. Cheers. Enjoy it.
My pleasure. Take care.
That's Ross Harries there. He's the presenter of BBC Scrum 5 and broadcaster of BT Sport.